I have in my hand a copy of the Bible. You can buy it in any bookstore. It's the most popular book that's sold every year. It can be found in many, many homes all over the world. Each year the Bible sells more and is translated more into more languages than any other book that's been published. The Bible is so well attested. The Bible is a book that each of us has some access to if we want to. The Bible came to us in a very interesting way, but many people never stop to think about how did we get the Bible? Well, the story of the history of the transmission of the Bible is very interesting, and we find from this that not only is it interesting, but the Bible is so well defined and so well attested to. The Bible is a book of great integrity. So you can depend on the Bible that you have in your home. There are more than 5,000 Greek manuscripts of the Bible. For just a minute, let's make a comparison between the number of manuscripts that we have of the Bible and the number of manuscripts we have of some other ancient writers. For example, Homer lived in the 8th century BC, but the earliest manuscript that we have of the writings of Homer comes to us from the 13th century AD. And then again, the great Greek historian Herodotus, he lived in the 400s BC, but the earliest manuscript that we have of his work comes to us from the 10th century AD. And then the writings of Virgil, the great Roman poet. Well, he lived about 70 BC until 19 BC, but his work is found in one manuscript that comes from the 4th century AD. Now, the writings of the Bible go all the way back to the first century, and the manuscripts that we have of the Bible date as early as just 50 to 100 years after the death of the last apostle. The Bible has come down to us in such an interesting way, but we have to relate it to the history of writing. When we see the history of writing and how the Bible came into all of this, it helps us to understand more about how we got the Bible. So I invite you now to join with me in this study, a brief study, of a survey of how the Bible came to us. As I said, it's the best attested book from the ancient world, but not many people know how we got it. We have some sort of ancient writing that comes to us from as early as 5000 BC. Now, there's not very much evidence about the very, very early writing, but we do have a great deal of evidence from writing on stones and writing on clay tablets. The ancient writing of the Egyptians was primarily hieroglyphics. But not many people realize this, but that also was something that the Babylonians used. It faded away among the ancient Babylonians, but it came to life among the ancient Egyptian people. In Babylon, they used something that they called cuneiform, and that dates back to about 3750 BC. Archaeologists have discovered a variety of cuneiform tablets. It was an interesting form of writing. Each country, each culture seems to have developed some of its own script and some of its own characteristics in writing. And the ancient Babylonians and the ancient Egyptians led the way in some of this. We don't know exactly when writing came to Palestine, but we do have evidence that writing was done in Palestine about 1500 BC. But there are also indications that writing came much earlier than this, because Moses, at the time of the Exodus, Moses wrote the book of the covenant. Chronological difficulties prevent us from knowing just exactly the time that Moses lived, but it was either around 1400 BC or perhaps around 1200 BC. Ancient writing material was primarily stone in the very beginning, and again, the ancient Babylonians used stone as a means of writing. The ancient Egyptians did the same thing. And one of the famous stones that we have that indicates the writing of the Egyptians was called the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone is one of the most famous of all of the stones containing writing. It was discovered in about 1799 by a soldier in the army of Napoleon. It dates back, in fact, to about 196 BC, at the time that King Ptolemy the fifth was the king of Egypt. Now there are three types of writing on the Rosetta Stone, and this is one of the things that makes it so interesting. There's writing in the Greek, which scholars knew, the writing of Demotic, which was a Coptic form of writing. The scholars also knew that. But there also was the writing of the hieroglyphics, which scholars did not know at that time. They didn't understand just exactly what all of those signs and symbols and pictures really meant. But someone got the idea that perhaps on this stone with the three writings, each of these languages was talking about the same thing. And so scholars began trying to make comparisons between the things that were written in the Greek, which was understood, and the Demotic, which also was understood, and whether or not they actually were the same as the hieroglyphics. And lo and behold, that's just exactly what took place. And so we have these three languages, and the Rosetta Stone formed the key to finding out something about how hieroglyphics really came to be and what the hieroglyphics meant. And of course, you remember the writing of Moses and the Ten Commandments and the Book of the Covenant. Well, in ancient Egypt, at the temple at Abu Simbel, we have writing all over the temple walls, and there's pictures and there's hieroglyphics all over the place on that. It comes from about the time of Moses, the 13th century BC. Well, there's another stone that's very interesting to us, and that's called the Moabite stone. The Moabite stone has an interesting history. It really tells some things about the time of King Jehu, king in the Old Testament who followed the time of King Ahab. The Moabite stone gives a little bit of information about what was going on in the Bible about that time. Interesting thing about this stone was that it was broken up into three pieces, and an enterprising young man tried to sell these to various farmers, saying that this was a sacred stone and it would help produce the crops. Well, the stone was finally reassembled, and today this very stone is found in one of the museums in Europe. And then we have also something that was very interesting called the Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi was a king of Babylon who lived about 1728 to 1686 BC. The Code of Hammurabi dates back to about 1723, and he wrote all kinds of laws that became pretty much the laws that were practiced among the people of Mesopotamia and all the way over into Palestine in some cases. The Code of Hammurabi is about 8 feet tall, and there are so many relationships between the practices of the people who lived under that code and the practices of the people that we find around the time of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Well, another form of writing was writing on clay tablets. Now, this is a very interesting thing and presented a very durable writing material. These little clay tablets would be formed and then with a stylus, they would make imprints of a wedge shape. And depending on just exactly how these wedge-shaped imprints were made, it formed a letter. And these letters were called the cuneiform script. And this was very popular and used throughout Mesopotamia, particularly in Babylon. And then after these clay tablets were imprinted in this way, they were baked in the sun or sometime in an oven. And so this preserved them so that now, thousands of years later, they still are in a very fine state of preservation, and scholars can read the information on these clay tablets. One of the most famous of all of the clay tablets was called the Gilgamesh epic. Well, the Gilgamesh epic is an interesting story because it's a story of a massive worldwide flood. It comes from ancient Babylon, and it shows that even outside of the Bible, people recognize that there had been some kind of a massive, massive flood. And the Gilgamesh epic tells something about that flood and a hero of that flood. Now, it doesn't parallel the story in the Bible, but it does show that a worldwide flood was something that was really very much thought of and experienced by ancient people. Another writing material that came to be very important was leather. Now we might expect that that would be used. Leather was probably first used in Egypt, and we do know that there are all kinds of leather things that the Egyptians wrote on. Although the Old Testament does not identify a particular type of material, there's a story in the book of Jeremiah of how the king took the script that Jeremiah had, the mighty scroll, and he took his penknife and he ripped it all to shreds and burned it. Well, that probably was a leather scroll because this is the thing that was used a great deal at that time by the people of that day. And then, of course, we probably have all heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls have a very fascinating story of their discovery. There was a young boy, about 14 years old, who was out in an area around the Dead Sea, and he was keeping his goats. And one of the goats got lost, and he went out to find the goat. And the way young boys do sometime, he was picking up rocks and throwing rocks to see if he could hit a target. And then he saw the opening of a cave that was elevated. So he threw a rock up there to see if he could throw it into the cave, and surely enough, he threw it into the cave, and he heard something crash. He went and got a friend, and together they made a little ladder, and they climbed up to the entrance of the cave, and there they found one of the greatest discoveries of modern times, so far as Bible manuscripts are concerned. These are called the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls, well, they didn't know exactly what they were worth at the time. They were bought and sold at various places and to various people. And as a matter of fact, one time, the Dead Sea Scrolls were offered for sale through a classified ad in the American journal called the Wall Street Journal. It's kind of an interesting thing that finally, when scholars got hold of this, they recognized that this was one of the manuscripts of greatest importance of the Old Testament that had ever been discovered. And then they went down and found an area where they thought the Romans had an old outpost. But it was not a Roman outpost at all. It turned out to be the community center of something that was called a sect that was called the Essenes. Now the Essenes were not really known to us in the Bible, and yet Josephus and a Roman writer by the name of Pliny, both of them mention the Essenes. And we know that they existed. And with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we get some information about what the Essenes believed and where they lived. and what the manner and character of the Essene community really was. Well, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls then turned out to be one of the most magnificent discoveries in modern time. It took place about 1947-48, right in through there. There was another writing material that was very, very important among the ancient people, and that was papyrus. As a matter of fact, the New Testament books were in all probability written on papyrus. Papyrus goes way back, probably as early as 3300 BC. Egypt was a place for papyrus because Egypt had the Nile River, and the papyrus plants grew in abundance along the Nile River. Well, the papyrus plant had a number of uses as far as the ancient Egyptians were concerned. There was a portion of the little reed and the pith on the inside that could be used for food, and some of the Egyptians actually ate this food of the papyrus. And then they discovered something about papyrus. They could unwrap this reed, lay it out and dry it, glue the pieces together, and it made a very fine writing material, a material to receive writing. And so by the 3rd millennium BC, we have a number of things that were written on papyrus. Papyrus was very inexpensive, abundant supply, relatively easy to get, and relatively easy to make into a scroll. So what they would do, they would lay these pieces of papyrus, as they unrolled it from the reed itself, they would lay these pieces of papyrus together, glue them, and then glue these sheets one to another, and they would make a scroll out of it. Well, this scroll would receive writing, and the book of Matthew, for example, would take a scroll for about 35 feet long. Papyrus being so cheap made it a very interesting writing material, and there certainly can be no doubt that the New Testament books were originally written on papyrus. Here we have the Chester Beatty Papyrus. This comes out of the 2nd century, about 180 to 200 AD, and what you see here is a leaf out of the Epistle to the Hebrews. Papyrus goes way back. We have one fragment of papyrus that goes all the way back into the early part of the 2nd century. It's a portion of the book of John, and it's called the John Rylands fragment. This John Rylands fragment has a portion of the book of John on it. The John Rylands fragment dates all the way back to the early part of the 2nd century, and it caused biblical scholars to realize that the book of John actually came out of the 1st century, because this little fragment, as small as it is, dates so early and was found down in Egypt that scholars concluded that the book of John had to have been written very early. Well, papyrus was such a wonderful writing material, but it had one real disadvantage. As papyrus aged, it became very fragile, it broke, and it was very easily destroyed. As a result of that, not very many, relatively speaking, not very many papyrus manuscripts have come down to us in the Bible. Well, the ancient Christians in the 2nd century decided that it was very difficult for them to take a long scroll, like, for example, Matthew, and they wanted to look something up in the latter part of the scroll and compare it to something in the earlier part of the scroll, and the scrolls were very difficult to use for the Christians. The Christians came up with a very good idea, apparently. They cut the papyrus into sheets, and they stacked these sheets together and folded them. And when they folded them, They then stacked the folds together and sewed them together, and the first thing you know, they had a book, very similar in its structure to the books that we have. And these were referred to as codex books, C-O-D-E-X, codex books. A very peculiar thing happened. The suppliers in Egypt, most of the papyrus, began to have a difficulty with some of the consumers of papyrus over in modern-day Turkey, around Pergamum. And the king decided that he would no longer allow papyrus to be shipped. Well, this cutting off of the papyrus, as people say sometimes, necessity is the mother of invention, and the cutting off of the papyrus called people to begin investigating, what else can we write on? And so they came up with the idea, maybe animal skins. No, not leather, but animal skins. Maybe animal skins can be used for this. And they developed a means of making what they call parchment from the animal skin. They made parchment by taking the skin, particularly the skin around the belly of the animal, and usually a very young animal, a calf, and then they would rub it with pumice and get all of the hair off of the skin, rub it with pumice, and somehow or another they found out that, oh, that is very, very durable. It's easy to write on. Kind of expensive, but if you had a document that was really important to you, not papyrus, but parchment was the thing to use. And then they developed this a little bit further into something that was even better than the parchment. They used younger animals, and they called this vellum. And through the years, the Bible, the New Testament particularly, was transmitted on vellum. And the manuscripts that we have today are primarily manuscripts written on vellum. And it's very, very durable. It lasted for centuries and centuries. Sometime they would dye this vellum purple, royalty, and sometime they would be decorated, the vellum would be decorated in gold and silver. And a great deal of artwork ultimately was used on this vellum. Vellum was very durable, kind of expensive, but very durable. And so we have here a manuscript of the Old Testament, a Hebrew manuscript, which was written on vellum. You'll see that it's in book form, it's not in scroll form. The history of writing played such an important role in the history of the Bible. How we got the Bible? Well, the Bible was written on a variety of materials over a long period of time. In our next lesson, we're going to talk about how the Bible came to be written and what the different sections of the Bible really contain. So we hope that you'll take a look at our next lesson.